It's, it's such a great mission to help support the diaspora, even through the cultural things, not just the very good work they do for kind of immigrants and seniors, but, the whole cultural aspect. So I'll spotlight you, Dan, in a second, and or Ambassador Mulhall. But I'll just welcome everyone first to the Irish American Heritage Museum and give you just a few kind of notes about our ambassador. So he's the ambassador of Ireland, of course, to the United States. Actually, this time last year he spoke for us too, but we were very new to technology, so I think we did not have picture that night. That was kind of my fault because we didn't have a Zoom subscription. He's a Waterford man, so that's good. He's a fellow Munster person, and he studied his both graduate and postgraduate work at University College Cork, where he specialised in modern Irish history and literature. And so he has been our 18th ambassador here in the States since August 2017, and had a varied career before that in Laos, Thailand and Vietnam. He also served in Germany, and he was the ambassador in London. He has had an amazing kind of literary career too. He has a very brilliant blog on the consulate's or the embassy's website, and he has held several positions in Europe. So he worked with the Department of Foreign Affairs, of course, Director General for European Affairs, and he was a member of the Secretariat of the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation. So he was part of the Irish government's delegation at the time of the Good Friday Agreement. So a very many hats. We're delighted to have him. And of course, love his interest in literature and history. He posts often poems on his Twitter, particularly when COVID started first, the lockdown. I was sharing them almost daily. And so he's a very kind of lively scholar, I would say, still of Irish literature and history, despite being a very busy ambassador. So we're delighted to have you. And you're going to speak to us tonight about the 4 Irish writers in America. And so, of course, there is this, huge transatlantic connection always between Ireland and America, going back to the time that America was a colony or were colonies. So we're delighted to hear about the late 19th and early 20th century with Ambassador Daniel Mulhall. So welcome.
Okay, well, first of all, always happy to talk to audiences all over America about Irish history and literature, which are my 2 great passions of my my sort of non-professional life, if you like. Because I mean, while this is connected with what I do as an ambassador, it's not essential. I you can be an ambassador without having any interest in Irish history and literature, but I happen to be one who has that interest, and I've always tried to share my knowledge of that subject to audiences all over the world, and I like doing so here in America, and it's great to be here with you this evening. So what I thought I would do is talk about 4 Irish writers who spent a good bit of time in America. 3 who spent a good bit of time in America, and one who was never here, but for whom America played a very big part in his artistic career. So the 4 I have in mind are Oscar Wilde, W.B. Yeats, Douglas Hyde, and James Joyce. Joyce never traveled to America. The others all spent considerable amounts of time here in this country. And of course, we all know that millions of people crossed the Atlantic in the 19th, 20th centuries. The ones who came across in the 19th century rarely got back to Ireland. Most of them never saw their homeland again, because traveling back was a big sort of expense, and most of them didn't ever get around to doing it. There were also, of course, a lot of Irish celebrities or public figures who came to America. And the reason they came here was because it was a lucrative place to come, because you had big audiences here among Irish Americans who were always happy to listen to events and to go to events involving Irish public figures. So you had Parnell came to America in the 1880s. De Valera, of course, came in the 1919 to 1921, spent about a year and a half in America. And Patrick Pearse also visited America at one stage, so did Roger Casement. So it was a well-trodden path. And for writers as well, there was a lot of attraction to coming to America, because you could find an audience here that was, enthusiastic to hear from Irish writers, and that's borne out by the stories of Wilde, Yeats, and Hyde. So let me start with Oscar Wilde. Wilde came to America in 1882, and he spent a full year traveling around America, and he gave a phenomenal number of lectures. Actually, I mean, in the year that he was here, he gave 141 lectures in 30 states, including New York. And by the way, I have the list of places he spoke at in New York. Apart from New York City, he spoke at a number of places. He spoke at, you can tell me whether any of these are near you. He spoke at Babylon, Narragansett Pier, Ballston Spa, Saratoga Springs, Sharon, Cooperstown, Richfield Springs, Haterskill, Long Beach, Cornwall Heights, Funica, Highmount. So he really did, travel to not just the big cities, but he traveled to quite smaller places around the country, and not just in New York, but also all over the country. He visited in all 30 states. He traveled 15,000 miles, and that was at a time when you had to travel by rail, or indeed perhaps by carriage even, if there weren't railway connections to the places he was going to. And like some of the places he went to, you'd never imagine that Oscar Wilde could have ever gone there. For example, back in 2019, I was visiting the town of Leadville, which some of you may know. It's in Colorado, up in the mountains, about 12,000 feet, so it's quite high. And I think it's the highest incorporated town in America. And I visited there, and of course it was a big mining town in the 19th century. A lot of Irish miners would have been there. But remarkably, they had an opera house, which is still there. It's called the Tabor Opera House. And I did a tour of the opera house, built in the 1870s, so very shortly before Wilde visited America. And I sat in a chair that had been used by Oscar Wilde when he visited that opera house in 1882. So, I mean, a place as remote. And I mean, I drove to Leadville. It took about 2 hours to get there by car from Denver. So I can imagine what it must have been like to try and get there 140 years ago. So the fact that he went to Leadville meant that he went to a lot of places that weren't on the normal circuit for people visiting America. And apparently he mixed with all sorts of people and made a big impression here. I mean, one of his biographers who wrote about his visit to America said that while Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America, a famous book about America from the 1830s, that while de Tocqueville came to learn about America, Wilde came so that America could learn about him. So he basically, in fact, this book written about his visit to America claims that he invented the notion of celebrity opera company, which is an opera company based in Britain, but they came and toured America as well. And they specialized in Gilbert and Sullivan operas. And he was sent by the D'Oyly Carte organization to promote their latest Gilbert and Sullivan offering, which they were doing in America. And Wilde was sent over to generate some interest in it, because one of the characters in the opera was loosely based on Wilde. So they wanted Wilde to go over and promote the opera for them. Of course, Wilde was clever enough to turn the whole thing into a bit of showmanship, or as his biographer says, showboatmanship, because he clearly enjoyed behaving in a way that attracted great attention. And in fact, his visit to America generated more than 500 articles in the newspapers all over the country. So he was a celebrity wherever he went, and he was he attracted a lot of attention because of the way he behaved. Now, the lectures he gave had nothing to do with Ireland, nothing at all. There were two lecture topics that he delivered. One was called the English Renaissance, and the second was the decorative arts. So nothing really Irish about his lectures at all. But his Irish background did not go unnoticed. And many Irish Americans turned up at Wilde's performances, not because he was this famous writer, which he wasn't actually. He was hardly well known at all, but he had an image. He was a man of image. And they turned up because, of course, in their eyes, the eyes of many Irish Americans at the time, he was the son of Lady Wilde, or Speranza, as she was known, who was a writer who wrote patriotic verses in the period around 1848, around the time of the Young Ireland movement. In fact, she was romantically attached to Thomas Francis Meagher, who ended up making a big impact in America as the general in charge of the Irish Brigade during the American Civil War. So Wilde's biographer, Richard Ellman, who's also the biographer of James Joyce, of course, wrote in his book about Wilde that, and I quote, Wilde rediscovered himself as an Irishman during his American tour. He rediscovered his Irish identity from connecting with Irish Americans who were interested in him because of his Irish background and his connection with the great patriotic poet Speranza. So moving on to Douglas Hyde. Hyde was Hyde is known in Irish history for he founded the Gaelic League in 1893.
Ambassador, you're fading a bit there.
Became an incubator.
Just you had low bandwidth, so we kind of lost you for a second just at the start of the Douglas.
Gosh, I mean, we've actually boosted our internet here big time. We paid a lot of money to upgrade it. So
no, technology is not our friend anyway, this year. But no, you're back. You're back. Yeah.
Okay. So Hyde, the Gaelic League turned out to be an incubator for Irish nationalist sentiment in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And we know that because a number of those who were involved in leading the Easter Rising, and I'm thinking, for example, of Patrick Pearse, of Thomas MacDonagh, and Eamon de Valera, all came into political activity through the Gaelic League. And that's the significance of the League, that it did inspire a generation of Irish people to start to rethink their idea of what it meant to be Irish. So Hyde was the son of a Church of Ireland clergyman in County Roscommon. And he learned Irish from the local people in the area where his father was a clergyman. And it became a lifelong passion. And after studying theology in Trinity College, probably expecting to follow in his father's footsteps, he decided to take a lecturing post at the University of New Brunswick in Canada. And he spent the academic year in Canada before traveling back to Ireland via Boston and New York. And in Boston and New York, he delivered a number of very well-attended lectures in which he tested out some of the ideas that later caused him to found the Gaelic League a couple of years after he went back to Ireland. So he, for example, in speaking in New York, he spoke about the linguistic pedigree of the Irish language. And he said, I quote, Irish is not a poor, mean, limited language, but a vast, varied, and opulent one. which stands up on an equal footing with Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. It was, Hyde said, the language of the bards and the Brehons, of the saints and the sages. Now, it's not difficult to imagine how Irish Americans at that time, children or maybe grandchildren of Irish immigrants, more likely children, and some of them would have been Irish immigrants themselves. And they probably were used to the Irish language being derided and, you know, regarded as a sort of a, almost like something that you should be ashamed of. And here you have this man, this distinguished academic, talking about the Irish language as the language of the bards and the Brehons, of saints and scholars and sages. So you can imagine how well that would have gone down with Irish Americans. Hyde spoke to those audiences in New York at that time. He wanted to see Irish established as a living language for all time among the 1 million or 500,000 who still speak Irish, who spoke Irish along the west coast of Ireland at that time. And according to the 1891 census, about 700,000 people in Ireland could speak Irish at that time. But that figure was down from 1.5 million 40 years earlier. And most of the reason for that was that those missing people were by and large years between those two census counts. So there were a lot of Irish speakers in America, and indeed, Hyde could often find an audience in America of people who could understand a lecture he could give in the Irish language. So when he came back, he delivered a very important speech, which was called The Necessity for De-Anglicizing the Irish Nation. Basically, that speech was what led to the founding of the Gaelic League. In the speech, Hyde called for the building up of a nation on Irish lines. In other words, a nation wouldn't just be independent, be Irish well, as in, and he said, so that it would once more become artistic, literary, and charming peoples in Europe. So the idea of the Gaelic League was that the Irish had become debased. They had lost their civilization along with their language. And the only way to revive the Irish spirit was to revive the language to which that spirit had traditionally over the centuries been expressed. By 1903, there were some 600 Gaelic League branches in Ireland, language lessons. Turning to W.B. Yeats, he made his first tour of America in 1903 and 1904. And you can see why he came, because he amassed a total of $3,200 from the fees he got from giving lectures all over America. And that was a fairly princely sum at that time. It was probably a lot more than Yeats would have been able to earn in Ireland or in Britain through his lecture and writing. So it was a particularly lucrative business for a writer like Yeats to be able to come to America and he spent 4 months. He delivered 60 lectures at American universities and elsewhere. And, you know, he earned quite a significant, the lecture he delivered the same lecture again and again. And one of the, so Yeats was then, he conjured up a pastoral, egalitarian future for Ireland, which would preserve what he called the ancient ideal of life. In other words, recreate Ireland away from this materialistic civilization that Britain had dragged it into by dominating Ireland for so long. He enthused about Ireland, where, and I quote, alone among the nations will be found, away on the western seaboard, under broken roofs, a race of gentlemen, keeping alive the ideals of a great time when men sang the heroic life with drawn swords in their hands. So here you had Yeats conjuring up an image of a heroic Ireland that he believed could be recovered if Ireland could become an independent country. When he wrote, or when he had produced his most nationalistic play, his most nationalistic work, the whole of everything that Yeats wrote, the work that he produced, together with Lady Gregory in this case, that was the most nationalistic of all of his works, was the play Kathleen de Houlihan. And his friend, his love interest, Maud Gonne, played the leading role. The play set during the 1798 rebellion. And it's about an old lady who comes to ask the people to help her get back her fields that she lost. So it's the old Four Green Fields idea. And the reference in the end is honor. And someone came in and was asked, did you see the old lady that passed you by down the path? She said, no, there was no old lady. It was a young woman, and she had the walk of a queen. So in other words, the idea of this old lady being transformed into a queenly figure because she had encouraged her sons and daughters to fight to restore her lost lands. So you can see a very, very, very straightforward nationalistic message in that. Now, Yeats was helped greatly by a New York lawyer called John Quinn. And John Quinn had doubts. He was worried that Yeats might not go down that well with Irish Americans because he had some very unorthodox religious views. He was interested in spirituality and magic and mysticism and so on, and wasn't a straightforward Christian by any means. But Yeats quickly won people over, and indeed the Fenian organization Clonagh Gael, set up by John Devoy, invited Yeats to deliver a lecture in memory of Robert Emmet, which is a pretty big deal because the Emmet annual Emmet commemoration at that time was a very big affair indeed. And in New York, at the Academy of Music in February 1904, attracted an attendance of 4,000. Now, it would have been impossible for Yeats to attract that kind of audience anywhere much of his life. In his speech, Yeats enthusiastically praised Emmet. He saw him as someone who, and I quote, showed that there was something in Ireland which not all the wealth of the world could purchase. He predicted that, I quote, when Ireland is triumphant and free, there will be change, which will have been put there by her years of suffering and by the memory of her many martyrs. Again, very strong sentiment, nationalist sentiment, straightforward, passionate nationalist sentiment. The idea that while Ireland might not be a wealthy country, it had things that wealth could not purchase. It had the sort of, the sacrifice for Ireland, such as Robert Emmet. Now, none of our, at that time, Yeats was being criticized in Ireland for not being sufficiently nationalistic by those who criticized him for writing in English when they believed that Irish literature should be written in the Irish language, which Yeats, of course, couldn't speak, so therefore couldn't use. But the way he spoke in America, the way he spoke at that event, no nationalist could have any objection to what Yeats said because it was thoroughly mainstream, passionate mainstream Irish nationalism. And I'm sure his audience must have lapped it up. Now, Douglas Hyde came back to America in 1905-6, and he spent 7 months here. Imagine that. I mean, these days, was to come to America for 7 days on an official trip. That would be regarded as a very long trip for 7 months. He spoke in 55 cities, from the eastern seaboard right across to California and Oregon. He spoke in New York for 90 minutes to a capacity audience at Carnegie Hall, telling them how the Gaelic League had transformed Ireland. Sum of money. They kept the Gaelic League going for some time. In Boston, he was met by Mayor John F. Fitzgerald, John F. Kennedy's grandfather. Everywhere he went, Irish Americans would turn out the deputation to meet the great man from Ireland. He made a journey, as he made a journey across America, he met lots of people who spoke Irish and whose company he really relished. But there were others among the more well-to-do Irish, the lace curtain Irish, that he had a disdain for because he felt that they were ashamed of their Irish heritage. On one of his 2 visits, there was a professor of Irish at the Catholic University in America, Dr. O'Dean, accompanied Douglas Hyde to, wait for it, the White House, where he had lunch with President Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt told him, fancy this, comparing the old Irish stories with the Norse sagas. Can you imagine writing an essay of that kind while serving as president? President Higgins could certainly do it and does do it, but for American presidents of the last 100 years, that would have been unthinkable. But that was the kind of president that Theodore Roosevelt claimed. Hyde spent a long train journey through Wyoming and Utah, and I've been there recently. I know how big those places are. Translating one of Dante's cantos into Irish. So they and Douglas Hyde were both very men of great intellect and energy and vigor. And Hyde's account of his trip to America has recently been published, and it's certainly well worth having a look at. He really did put a huge amount of energy into the travel, huge distances he traveled on trains. And he also, in his book, he records many a late evening of conviviality when after the lecture he would repair to a local club or whatever with some Irish people that he met, and they were by American cocktails. And in particular, he loved a cocktail he was introduced to at Washington's Willard Hotel, something called a mint julep, which I've occasionally had myself, and I can sort of verify that it's. Yeats came back in 1911, and that was at a time when he was getting very sour about Ireland, mainly because his friend John Millington Synge's play in Ireland, and there'd been disturbances in the theatre, and then Synge had died, and Yeats turned Synge into a kind of a martyr, a man who had died for his art, a man who was the epitome of artistic integrity and had been spurned by the Irish. And that really turned Yeats against a lot of those who had criticized Synge. And in fact, there were many in America, among Irish Americans, who criticized Synge as well. And when Yeats was here with the Abbey Theatre at that time, and they were putting on, there was a lot of resistance to the play from Irish Americans who had heard about the furore in Ireland and took the same view that this was in some way an offense to Ireland. And one Irish American organization described the Playboy as, quote, the foulest libel that has ever been perpetrated on the Irish character. So Yeats, of course, was never one to shirk a battle with his opponents or his critics in Synge's genius, as he saw it. And he said, and I quote, Synge took his types from reality indeed, but he exaggerated them and arranged them according to his fancy until he created something as strange as the Wandering Knight and the Sancho Panza of Cervantes. Cervantes Don Quixote. He was comparing Synge with Don Quixote, with Cervantes, and that was the kind of, from those who criticized Synge for defaming the Irish people. By the time of his visit in 1914, Yeats had become further soured about Ireland. In his 1913 collection, Responsibilities, were very critical of the Ireland of his time, September 1913, about fumbling in a greasy till and adding the halfpence to the pence, and prayer to shivering prayer until they have dried the marrow from the bone. But then he conjured up, of course, as well, this sort of image of, was it for this the wild geese spread the grey wing on every tide, for this that all that blood was shed, for this Edward Fitzgerald, that delirium of the brave. Yeats, of course, on that trip to America, raised £500 in a few months. And remember, the previous year, his total income was £500. So he earned in a few months in America as much as he would have earned for a whole year the previous year by not coming to America. And Yeats's last two visits to America, one was in 1920 during the war, although he was worried about the impact of violence on Ireland, and talked about political fanaticism, which he criticized and said that it was a bitter acid that destroyed the soul. His final visit to America was likewise designed to raise money, this time for the Irish Academy of Letters, which he established in the early 30s along with George Russell and others. He was always described as Ireland's cultural ambassador. He was always willing to offer a commentary on events in Ireland, and the media always gave him a good, punchy comment on events in Ireland. Finally, James Joyce in America. Well, Joyce never crossed the Atlantic, never left the European continent, but he had a lot to do with America. During the First World War, when he was in Zurich, writing Ulysses, and with very little money, he received financial support from a woman called Mrs. McCormack was her name. But that doesn't tell the whole story. Her full name was Edith Rockefeller McCormack. Her married name was McCormack, richest American, possibly of all time, but certainly of that era. She was a very substantially wealthy heiress. And she provided anonymous support for Joyce, 1,000 francs a month for a full year, which is a princely sum in those days. He also benefited from the support of in Joyce's work relentlessly. And it was Pound who introduced Joyce to the editors of the New York avant-garde publication, The Little Review, Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap. And they published episodes of Ulysses from 1918 until publication was halted by legal action in the New York courts in 1921. Writing to Anderson, Ezra Pound said that Ulysses was, I quote, rather better than Flaubert. So for Pound, this was a genuine classic that Joyce had written. And of course, Pound was only seeing episodes as they were, but he was enthusiastic. And Margaret Anderson, the New York publisher of The Little Review, she said that the first 3 episodes was the most beautiful thing we'll ever have to publish. We're going to present a masterpiece to America, she said. Pound, of course, also sought to rein Joyce in. He considered some of Joyce's excesses in terms of style and content to be detrimental to Ulysses and likely to have the book banned. Of course, refused to do so and dismissed Pound's advice. Pound also advised Joyce not to be so experimental in style of his writing. He said, you don't need to have a different style for every episode. Joyce claimed he did need to do that because that was the only way he could convey the full complexity of a Dublin day in the space of one book. So after a number of scrapes with censorship, the Little Review finally came to grief when in 1920 it published the last part of the Nausicaa episode of Ulysses, which takes place on of June 1904. And in that scene, Bloom becomes excited when this girl on the beach, this young woman on the beach, Gertie MacDowell, shows him a little bit of her undergarments, and that was enough to convince the judges of that time that this was an obscene book. And a book therefore, the Little Review were fined $100, which is a lot of money in those days. And of course, they could not publish any more of Ulysses. So Joyce was in a real pickle then, because with that judgment, no American publisher could print a book, and British publishers took the same view. It was America, they weren't going to touch it either. So he had to revert to another American who got him out of a jam. And that was a woman called Sylvia Beach. And she was a Baltimore native who at that time lived in Paris, had a small bookshop, an English language bookshop, under her company's imprint, Shakespeare and Company. And that's how the book came out on the 2nd of February, 1922. So next year will be the centenary of the publication of Ulysses. And I'm happy to say that having been with this book, having delved into it for the best part of 40 years and talked about it all over the world, I have now written a book about Ulysses, which will be published in January of next year by New Island Books in Dublin. And hopefully I'll have an American publisher, but certainly books will be available here in America sometime in the early part of next year. Now, it took another 12 years for Ulysses to be unbanned in America. And that happened when its prospective publishers, Random House, took a case. What they did was they imported a copy, impounded, which it was, and then took a case to appeal the impounding of this copy of Ulysses. And the judge in the case, in fact, the lawyer was a man called Morris Ernst, and he successfully argued the case, and the ban was lifted by Judge John M. Woolsey of the New York Southern District Court. And Ernst, the lawyer who represented Random House, said that this was, I quote, "The new deal in law and letters has just arrived," he said. Judge Woolsey described Joyce's novel as an amazing tour de force, which, on account of its style and literary ambition, could not be considered obscene. So basically, this is a very important milestone judgment because it did away with the notion that a book was obscene because of its content. This judge argued, and the appeal court upheld the judgment. The argument was that, no, this is a serious attempt at a serious literary product, and therefore its literary value cancels out any obscenity that might be there. So in conclusion, Douglas Hyde helped to bring into being the influential movement emerged during the decades before the Easter Rising, Gaelic League. W.B. Yeats was ambivalent about Hyde because Hyde wanted an Irish Ireland, and Yeats, being an English language writer, didn't go all the way along the road to the idea of an Irish Ireland that would be Irish speaking and Catholic and religion and so on. Yeats is very different, had a very different view of Ireland. But he did give Hyde great credit. He wrote about Hyde, he spoke about Hyde when he received the Nobel Prize in 1923. He said, Dr. Hyde founded the Gaelic League, which was for many years a substitute for political arguments, a Gaelic grammar, and for political meetings, the gathering, the songs were Yeats had was that after the fall of Parnell, cultural movements emerged, including the Gaelic League, and they actually turned Irish people away from a narrow definition of politics into a broader definition. And that broader movement eventually brought about the revolution that delivered independence to Ireland in 1921-22. Hyde's was greeted with great enthusiasm in America. And this suggests that his vision of linguistic and cultural regeneration for Ireland resonated positively with many Irish Americans he met during his visit to America in 1906 and 07. In all, W.B. Yeats spent more than a year of his life in North America. Spurred on, no doubt, the strength of patriotic sentiment he encountered among Irish Americans, Yeats made some of his most overtly nationalistic pronouncements while he was in America, in particular during his tour in 1903 and 1904, and especially in that great speech he gave of 1904. Now, turning to James Joyce, one has to wonder if Ulysses would ever have been finalized without the support Joyce received from a number of Americans: Edith Rockefeller, McCormick, Ezra Pound, Margaret Anderson, and Sylvia Beach. The New York Judgment of 1933 was a landmark for modern literature in that it extended the license available to aesthetically ambitious writers like Joyce. And without America, Oscar Wilde might never have acquired the aura of literary celebrity that made him and then unmade him in the 15 years after his visit to America in 1882. So thank you for your attention. Happy to answer any questions you may have, but it's been great having a chance to talk about these four writers and their association with America, which in the case of all of them was really very important in their careers. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great, Ambassador Mulhall. Thank you. Everyone is muted. That's why you're not hearing the applause. But Kathleen says, thank you. Very interesting. So, yeah, you know, what I was struck by when I was listening to you was the change that even Irish America itself underwent in that kind of, we'll give it even 40 years, you know, from kind of the early days of Oscar Wilde. And you mentioned the lace curtain Irish. I remember when I was researching for my dissertation, seeing the stories about the riots, you know, against the Sing play in Brooklyn, you know, and against a very popular vaudeville play that an act two brothers from Limerick used to do. They were called the Russell Brothers. And literally, like, one year, it was the biggest hit on vaudeville, and the following year, Irish people threatened to burn down the theatre, and they were pelting them with cabbages and stuff because the two brothers dressed up as, you know, maids and kind of were teasing the stock Irish maid character. You know, lovingly, obviously, because they're from Ireland themselves. But
yeah, that was.
Yeah, tell me. Mm-hmm. Oh, wait, I've lost you. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, now we regard the play by the Western world as a great Irish.
Yeah.
I said, now we regard the play by the Western world as a great Irish classic. But you have to remember that it was deeply offensive to Irish people when it was first produced in 1909. You have to think that those who opposed the Playboy were being a little bit to have a problem with the idea that a woman from the west of Ireland might be attracted by a fellow who came in to the area having claimed to have killed his father. Well, that doesn't, I mean, human nature being what it is, it's a kind of celebrity, I suppose, in its own way. And of course, we know in the end that he killed his father anyway, so he wasn't actually the kind of, you know, the kind of villain that he claimed to be. But you know, it's I mean, obviously, Singh captured something about the west of Ireland, because we now watch those plays, and they're coming. They keep being revived and they keep being produced in different parts of the world. I saw the whole thing. I saw the whole Sing cycle once. I saw all of Sing's plays in one sitting in Edinburgh at the festival there about 20 years ago. Now I was sore after it because sitting down for that long, even with a break for coffee or whatever, is not it's not the best of experiences. But certainly they still are part of the art.
Yeah.
But at the time they were controversial.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I think for an American audience too, that's trying to, sort itself out and claim its place as good Americans, they're maybe trying to distance themselves from a rural sort of aspect. So if anyone does have questions on Facebook, you could type them there and I'll moderate that. But Bob has said, do you have a favourite among the four? And he says that Oscar Wilde visited 30 states and there were only 38 in 1882. So that was impressive. But do you have a favourite of the four writers?
Obviously, I recognize that Joyce and Yeats were giants of literature, and Yeats, I think, is our Shakespeare. To be honest, that would be my kind of analysis or assessment of Yeats. I mean, Joyce. I wrote a piece recently, or I gave a lecture recently about Yeats and Joyce. I made the point that they're kind of, in a way, complementary, because Yeats wrote all these poems about, a terrible beauty is born, and about, was it excessive love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. Connolly and McBride, MacDonagh and McBride, and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be wherever green is worn or change utterly, a terrible beauty is born. So Yeats was a great visionary when it came to all things, including Ireland, and even if you look at his last, poem under Ben Bulben, he talks about the indomitable Irishry. You must not forget that we are, a special people. That was Yeats's view of Ireland. Whereas for Joyce, of course, Joyce knew Ireland better than Yeats did, and that he grew up in a sort of a normalish household and kind of understood, whereas Yeats lived his life moving between artistic circles in Dublin and London, and really didn't maybe have the same grasp of Ireland. So I just think the two of them, if you look at the two of them together, you get a very rounded picture of Ireland. You get the idealism of Yeats and the realism of Joyce's works as well. You combine nicely. But if I had to choose someone to have a drink with, I think it might be Douglas Hyde. He was an interesting man who was able to, get people to, he was obviously a convivial man who liked, he liked a glass of wine or whatever it was, late at night after he'd done his business. And I think he would have been quite an interesting companion. I think he would have good stories to tell about the West of Ireland and about, the Gaelic League and so on. So I think if I had a choice, I think Yeats would have been a little difficult to penetrate, and Joyce would have probably, not really thought I was up to his standard, probably. So I think Hyde is kind of a more genuine man who probably would have related quite well to a lot of people today.
Yeah. Well, it was phenomenal, the work that they did. I gave a talk myself on the Gaelic League last year for, actually, I think the Saratoga AOH, and as you said, so many of the Irish speakers were the immigrants, during those two census kind of takes, and so there was a huge Irish language group here, and so it's amazing that a lot of that work and fundraising is done here to send back, rather than kind of the other way around. But yeah, and then of course, Hyde is our first president. It was we're doing a centenary series for the 1921 and the whole, well, we'll probably go up to 22 or 23 with it, but to have a man like that, a Protestant, an Anglo-Irish, and yet a Gaelic lover, so he was a round enough character that he could represent a lot of people in Ireland, as that first figurehead, which was important, I think. And you don't know if he would have been.
Well, the Love Songs of Connacht was a really fine piece of work. It was sort of, bringing the Irish Gaelic tradition into English in a very powerful way, and it just shows the fact that when he came to America, he was invited to Harvard and Yale and Princeton to speak. So it showed that the Irish literary revival, even people like Hyde, had become international figures because they had created something new and different in Ireland, which, remember, Oscar Wilde would never have thought about the idea of creating a literature in Ireland that would be Irish. Whereas Yeats devoted his life to that. And so did Hyde. Now, Hyde's idea was that literature should be in Irish, whereas Yeats insisted it should be in English. But nonetheless, they at least they shared the idea that there should be something called Irish literature. Whereas that would have been in the time of Wilde, that would have been something that he would have been completely flummoxed by. I mean, by the time he finished, maybe in the 1890s, he would have been aware of what had happened, but he would have had no interest in going down that road. Whereas he did take that path, and it was a path that could have been costly to him, because it could have lost him a lot of profile in Britain. But he managed to create something in Ireland that was both Irish, but also had an appeal to people outside of Ireland, and continues to have to this very day.
So Bob is saying you were outstanding, wonderful to listen to you. You have to come to the New York Capital Region. So that's definitely true. We have
on my way.
An invite in the post. Yeah, well, we'll be able to put together a couple of days itinerary for you.
I should go up and visit the governor. I've never done that. I haven't visited the legislature either. I mean, I know some of the...
Oh, God, yeah. We're very... the American Irish Legislative Society are part of the reason the museum exists, actually, you know, so... they'd love to meet you, and we've gotten great support from them this year again now, post-COVID, you know, so we'd love to take you around. Kathy and Margaret Lash on Facebook say thank you, Ambassador, for another very interesting talk. Does anyone else have any questions or comments here on Facebook? Jack or Jean or Betty, I see our stalwarts are in. No, you're all quiet. So Jack Callahan or John Callahan there is actually going to give a lecture next month on Joyce, and we just celebrated, as I say, Yeats Day and Bloom's Day. But you know, I want to thank you very much. I know there's a lot going on politically here. It was so funny to hear the New York Southern District being involved in those cases, you know. So, like, some things don't change, just the topics change. And of course, a very important vote tonight there. My New York Times alerts are hopping, so I haven't read anything yet. But, you know, this, I think, is very important work, Ambassador Mulhall, and I really appreciate the fact that you do take time out of your very busy schedule of being an actual ambassador, you know, politically and diplomatically, to also kind of support the cultural side, because that is the mission of the museum here, you know, to educate about the Irish in America. So we're delighted to have you back. And I know it's been an intense year.
Intellectual heritage.
Thank you. That's Jack, yeah. So... they're all saying thank you here too, yeah. So lots of fans, and we can't wait for your book, says Jean, and we're definitely looking forward to hosting you in the Capital Region. We'll show you a good time, and you have lots of visitors.
I will come up sometime, you know, after, you know, the summer break, and I'll come up to Albany, okay?
Well, we'll have a new Consul General, I think, by then.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, so
you
know,
she's...
so you'll have to bring Emer up out of Belgium to see us here.
Her name is Helena.
Helena, yeah.
Nolan, but she's great. She's a very fine diplomat, and I think we'll go down very well there, you know. I mean, obviously I'll miss Kieran, but, you know,
I know.
Helena is a very good person. I think you'll all find her very, very engaging and very good to deal with.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to meeting her. Kieran has been great to us too, of course. But Pat, did you have a question, or are you just clapping?
No, I'm fine. Thanks so much, Ambassador.
Okay, great. Well, look, thank you everyone for joining, and again, Ambassador, thank you so much. You know, we really appreciate it, and we'll be in touch, and we're looking forward to hosting you.
It'll be great. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Take care. God bless everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, guys. Thank you.